Our previous video discussed the idea of economic growth. So economic growth is sort of the average increase over time in our incomes. So if I kind of draw a picture over here, of time and income per person, economic growth is the general increase over time. We also call that sometimes the trend, sort of the average increase or decrease over time. Now, that's economic growth, the average upward trajectory of our incomes per person. When you looked closely at the graph, you also saw that there was lots of bumps along the way. Those are what we call business cycles. So a business cycle, if I define it formally, is the fluctuations of economic activity around the trend. So if I make so if this is, I'm going to define this, I'm going to call this GDP. Now right now you have no idea what GDP is. Okay, so that's what we're going to work on defining in this chapter. But GDP, it's called gross domestic product. For right now, take that as, that means economic activity. Right? So for whatever reason, I'm calling economic activity GDP. So sequence of letters. So we'll figure out what that means over time. So we have a trend, which is economic growth. And then around that trend, we have our business cycles. Now, there's different parts of the business cycle. So the part where economic activity is increasing is called an expansion. The part where economic activity is decreasing is called a recession. So if I wanted to define a recession, it's declining economic activity. So a slightly more specific definition. So the way that we actually define a recession as having occurred or started using data on economic activity, or GDP, is 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. Sorry, I'm misspelling consecutive. Quarters, I was jumping ahead to quarters there. 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. Now, you don't know what GDP is yet. It's our measure of economic activity. But I can understand the basic idea of a recession and how I specify that one is started. A recession, which is this downturn in economic activity, officially commences when we've had 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. So most recently, starting in the second quarter of 2020, we entered a recession. So GDP growth was negative in both the second and the third quarter of 2021. So that's 2 consecutive quarters, which makes it officially a recession. So over time, the economy is constantly cycling between expansions and recessions. One of the things we'll note is that over the past 120 years that we had looked at previously, in addition to our incomes increasing significantly, expansions have gotten longer and recessions have gotten shorter. So the fluctuations have sort of dampened out a little bit over time. So that is really good news. But more specifically, we have a very good definition of a recession. Anything in between recessions is what we call an expansion. So there's a few other terms here, people being unemployed and the unemployment rate. Those are something we'll come back to a little bit later in the semester, not necessarily something we need right now. Okay, so those are some basic definitions. We're going to take those and move on to trying to understand what exactly is GDP, this measure of economic activity.